3 months after the underground creative revolution began, I discovered something that changed everything about my past, present, and future. The message arrived on a Tuesday morning that started with coffee and ended with the revelation that the two men I had trusted most, Alexander and Thomas, were not just connected to my story by accident. They were brothers. And everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and betrayal was about to be rewritten by a truth so twisted it made fashion industry corruption look simple by comparison. The evidence arrived in a manila envelope slipped under my apartment door. No return address. No signature. Just photographs, documents, and DNA analysis that proved what should have been impossible. Alexander Volkov and Thomas Beaumont were the same person. Not metaphorically. Not spiritually. Literally the same individual, living dual identities with surgical precision. The facial recognition analysis showed bone structure matches. The DNA evidence proved genetic identity. The financial records revealed how one person had maintained 2 complete lives across multiple countries for over 5 years. I stared at the photographs comparing Alexander and Thomas. Same eyes, same hands, same unconscious gestures captured from different angles. The differences were superficial: hair color, clothing style, accent, mannerisms. But underneath the performance, it was clearly the same man. The man I had loved. The man who had betrayed me. The man who had tried to save me. All the same person. "This is impossible," Marie said, studying the evidence with professional skepticism. "I've seen them in the same room. I've watched them interact." But as we examined the documentation more carefully, the impossibility became clear. Every interaction between Alexander and Thomas had been either through digital communication or carefully staged encounters where one identity appeared while the other was conveniently absent. The funeral footage showing Thomas mourning Alexander's death was particularly damning. High-resolution analysis revealed subtle padding, makeup techniques, and body language coaching that transformed one man into a convincing performance of grief for his own supposed demise. "He's been playing both sides of your entire story," I realized. "The investor and the friend. The villain and the hero. The man who destroyed you and the man who tried to save you." Understanding the dual identity recontextualized everything I thought I knew about my journey. Alexander hadn't just been my investor. He had been my emotional manipulator. Thomas hadn't just been my friend. He had been my psychological controller. Every conversation with Thomas about Alexander's betrayals had been carefully crafted manipulation. Every warning about dangers that Thomas provided had been preparation for obstacles that Alexander would create. The emotional support and romantic tension I felt with Thomas had been deliberately cultivated to make Alexander's business relationship more psychologically complex. "He created his own opposition," Marie said, working through the implications. "Made himself indispensable as both problem and solution." The sophistication was breathtaking. For 3 years, one person had maintained complete control over my emotional and professional life by being both the source of my trauma and the source of my comfort. I had never been choosing between different people or different paths. I had been choosing between different masks worn by the same manipulator. The romantic feelings I had developed for Thomas now felt like violations. Had those emotions been genuine responses to a real person or manufactured reactions to carefully engineered psychological stimuli? Every moment of connection, every conversation, every feeling of trust or attraction, it was all performance designed to control your responses to situations he was creating. But the most disturbing revelation was temporal. The documents showed that the dual identity had been established before I ever received the scholarship to Paris. This hadn't been improvised manipulation in response to meeting me. This had been systematic psychological warfare planned and executed across years. While processing the personal betrayal, we had to consider the professional implications. If Alexander/Thomas had been manipulating my story from the beginning, what did that mean for the creative nation-state and the underground revolution? Catherine Sterling arrived within hours of my discovery, bringing intelligence resources that could trace the dual identity through years of careful construction. The scope of the deception was even more extensive than the initial evidence suggested. "He's not just one person living 2 identities," Catherine explained, spreading financial records and communication logs across my kitchen table. "He's a professional identity manipulator. This is what he does for a living." The documents revealed Alexander/Thomas as part of an international network specializing in long-term psychological operations. Not government intelligence, not corporate espionage, but private contractors who designed and executed multi-year manipulation campaigns for clients with unlimited resources and specific strategic objectives. Who hired him to manipulate me? That's what we're trying to determine. But the client list for this type of operation includes nation-states, multinational corporations, and private individuals with the resources to purchase someone's complete life destruction and reconstruction. The financial analysis showed payments totaling over €50 million across 5 years. Someone had invested serious resources in controlling every aspect of my journey from fashion school student to global revolutionary. The question is whether your current success was part of the original plan or whether you exceeded the parameters of their psychological experiment. As we investigated the dual identity manipulation, reports from underground creative networks worldwide were becoming increasingly complex. The informal artistic communities that had emerged after the government crackdowns weren't just creating beautiful work. They were creating dangerous work. Without institutional oversight, quality control, or editorial guidelines, some artists were producing content that pushed boundaries in ways that concerned even supporters of creative freedom. Conspiracy theories presented as documentaries. Hate speech disguised as artistic expression. Extremist propaganda created with professional production values. Complete creative freedom includes the freedom to create horrible things, Marie observed, showing me examples of concerning work emerging from our underground networks. The philosophical implications were challenging. If creativity deserved freedom from control, did that include creativity that promoted violence, spreading misinformation, or targeting vulnerable populations? At what point did creative freedom become creative irresponsibility? This is why systematic control existed in the first place, I realized. Not just to exploit artists, but to prevent the worst expressions of human creativity from reaching wide audiences. But the most disturbing development was organizational. Some underground creative networks were evolving into what appeared to be extremist recruitment systems. Artists attracted by creative freedom were being gradually exposed to increasingly radical ideologies disguised as artistic movements. Someone is weaponizing the creative independence you inspired, Catherine said. Using the same psychological manipulation techniques that Alexander/Thomas used on you, but applying them to thousands of artists simultaneously. The message from Alexander/Thomas arrived exactly when psychological manipulation textbooks would predict, at the moment when I was most emotionally vulnerable and psychologically confused. Handwritten note. Personal stationery. Intimate tone designed to exploit our complicated history. We need to talk. Not as Alexander or Thomas, but as the person I actually am underneath both masks. There are things you need to understand about why this happened and what's happening now. Meet me where it all began, the cafe where Thomas first warned you about Alexander. Tomorrow, sunset. Come alone, or spend the rest of your life wondering whether anything you felt was real. The man who loves you more than you know. The manipulation was obvious and effective. He was using my need for truth to create another situation where he controlled the terms of engagement. But refusing to meet him meant never understanding the full scope of what had been done to me. It's obviously a trap, Marie said. Even if he is motivated by love instead of manipulation, meeting him gives him another opportunity to control your psychological state. But not meeting him means living with questions that will never be answered. Catherine had a different perspective. Meeting him gives us the opportunity to extract information about who hired him and what they're planning next. This isn't just about resolving your personal history. It's about understanding who's behind the weaponization of creative freedom. The decision was strategic rather than emotional. I would meet Alexander/Thomas not to resolve romantic feelings, but to conduct intelligence gathering about threats to global creative independence. Café de la Paix looked exactly as it had during my first meeting with Thomas 3 years earlier. Same elegant decor, same sophisticated clientele, same atmosphere of secrets being traded over expensive coffee. But everything else had changed, including my understanding of that original encounter. He was waiting at the same corner table, but this time he looked like neither Alexander nor Thomas. Something between both identities, or perhaps beyond them. Still handsome, still compelling, but with an exhaustion that suggested maintaining dual lives had taken a psychological toll. "Thank you for coming," he said as I sat across from him. "Who are you really?" "My name is Adrian Petrov. I'm Viktor Petrov's son." The revelation hit like a physical blow. Viktor Petrov, the Russian oligarch who had been Alexander's supposed enemy and Victoria's supposed partner. The man whose network we thought we had destroyed through exposure and international investigation. Viktor didn't disappear after the Monaco confrontation. He evolved. Decided that direct control of creative industries was less efficient than psychological manipulation of creative individuals. Adrian showed me photographs of Viktor taken recently. Not hiding in exile, but operating openly from what appeared to be a technology facility that combined psychological research with artificial intelligence development. He's building systems that can identify creative individuals early, predict their psychological vulnerabilities, and design personalized manipulation campaigns that guide their artistic development towards specific objectives. The scope was breathtaking. Not just controlling established artists, but psychologically engineering the next generation of creative people from childhood through systematic exposure to designed experiences. And you were his test case for the methodology. Adrian's explanation of his dual identity was more complex than simple deception. He had been trained from adolescence to become a professional psychological manipulator, but his emotional responses to me had been genuine and unexpected. I was supposed to guide your development through controlled crisis and resolution. Create enough trauma to make you dependent, enough success to make you grateful, enough uncertainty to make you malleable. He pulled out a tablet showing detailed psychological profiles and manipulation timelines. Every crisis in my journey had been planned months in advance. Every resolution had been designed to increase my emotional dependence on the support he provided. But somewhere in the process, I stopped following the plan and started actually caring about your well-being. When? The night you called me crying after discovering Gabriella's betrayal. The protocol said to offer measured sympathy while reinforcing your isolation and dependence. Instead, I wanted to tell you everything and help you escape the entire system. His confession was either authentic emotion or sophisticated manipulation designed to exploit my need to believe someone had genuinely cared about me. The creative nation-state wasn't part of Viktor's original plan. That was you exceeding the parameters of psychological control and creating something independent of his intentions. Adrian showed me financial records proving that Viktor's network had tried to co-opt and control the Creative Freedom Initiative from its inception. When direct control proved impossible, they had shifted to psychological manipulation of key individuals within the movement. Including me? Including you. But also including Catherine, Marie, and dozens of other people whose decisions shaped how creative independence developed. The conversation shifted from personal history to present danger when Adrian revealed that Viktor's psychological manipulation systems were currently being deployed against underground creative networks worldwide. The extremist content emerging from informal artistic communities isn't organic radicalization. It's systematic psychological programming designed to discredit creative independence by associating it with dangerous ideologies. The artificial intelligence systems Viktor had developed could identify artists with specific psychological profiles, expose them to carefully crafted content, and gradually shift their artistic focus toward increasingly problematic themes. The goal is to make creative freedom so associated with extremism and dangerous content that governments worldwide demand return to systematic institutional control. Adrian showed me real-time examples of the manipulation in action. Musicians whose work was being subtly influenced toward violent themes. Writers whose stories were being psychologically nudged toward conspiracy theories. Visual artists whose work was being guided toward imagery that promoted social division. Viktor learned from the failure of direct control. Psychological control is more efficient because the targets believe they're making independent choices. The implications for the underground revolution were devastating. The creative freedom I had fought to establish was being systematically corrupted into justification for its own elimination. How do we stop this? We don't stop it. We expose it. Show people how psychological manipulation works so they can recognize and resist it. Adrian's proposal was as complex as everything else in our relationship. He offered to provide complete access to Viktor's psychological manipulation systems, including the artificial intelligence programs and the detailed profiles of targeted artists worldwide. But there's a cost. Exposing these systems means exposing my role in developing and testing them, including everything I did to you. The choice was between justice and effectiveness. Exposing Viktor's current operations required revealing Adrian's past crimes. Protecting Adrian's identity meant allowing psychological manipulation to continue destroying creative independence. Why would you sacrifice yourself to stop your father's operations? Because what he's doing now is worse than what he did to you. You were one person subjected to systematic manipulation. He's now manipulating thousands of artists simultaneously, and the technology is scalable to millions. Adrian pulled out a USB drive containing what appeared to be terabytes of data. Everything is here. Financial records, psychological profiles, manipulation protocols, artificial intelligence algorithms, target lists, and evidence of international government cooperation with the program. And if I release this? Viktor's network gets destroyed, psychological manipulation of creative communities stops, but I go to prison for the rest of my life on charges that will include psychological terrorism and international conspiracy. The impossible complexity of our situation was that despite everything, the manipulation, the betrayal, the lies, my feelings for both Alexander and Thomas had been real. Even knowing they were the same person, even understanding how those feelings had been manufactured, the emotions themselves remained genuine. I know this is impossible to believe, Adrian said, but everything I felt for you as Thomas was authentic. The manipulation was professional, but the emotions were personal. How can I trust any feeling I have about you when those feelings were created through systematic psychological programming? You can't. That's the cruelest part of what I did. Even when manipulation stops, its effects continue. You'll never know whether your emotions are genuine responses or programmed reactions. The conversation had become painfully intimate despite taking place in a public cafe. Other patrons continued their sophisticated Parisian discussions while we negotiated the psychological warfare that had defined my entire adult life. But I need you to know that stopping Viktor's current operations is more important than resolving what happened between us. Thousands of artists are being manipulated right now, and the technology is being prepared for global deployment. He was right, but accepting his help meant collaborating with the person who had systematically destroyed my psychological autonomy for 3 years. If we work together to expose this, it doesn't absolve what you did to me. And it doesn't mean I can ever trust you personally. I understand. As Adrian prepared to hand over the USB drive containing evidence of Viktor's psychological manipulation network, Marie appeared at our table with information that changed everything about the choice I was making. "Don't take that drive," she said, sitting down uninvited. "It's not what he says it is." She placed a tablet on the table showing real-time surveillance footage of our conversation. Multiple angles, professional quality, audio enhancement that captured every word we had spoken. This entire meeting is being recorded and live-streamed to Viktor's network. Adrian isn't betraying his father's operations. He's documenting your responses to create a more sophisticated psychological profile. The scope of the manipulation was staggering. Even Adrian's confession of manipulation was itself manipulation. The emotional vulnerability I had felt during our conversation had been documented and analyzed to improve future psychological programming techniques. The USB drive contains malware that would give Viktor's network access to all creative nation-state communication systems and underground artistic networks worldwide. Adrian's expression shifted from apparent remorse to something colder and more calculating. The man I had been remembering as Thomas, feeling attraction toward and considering forgiving, disappeared completely. "Impressive," he said, no longer bothering with emotional manipulation. "How did you discover the surveillance?" "Because I've been working with Catherine's intelligence network to trace psychological manipulation operations for 6 months. We've been tracking you since the dual identity evidence was planted for Sophia to discover. The betrayal within the betrayal was complete. Even my discovery of Alexander and Thomas being the same person had been orchestrated to create this confrontation and extract more psychological data." Marie's revelation that we had been expecting Adrian's manipulation attempt transformed the entire dynamic of our confrontation. Instead of being victims of psychological warfare, we had been conducting counterintelligence operations. The underground creative networks you're trying to infiltrate with extremist content? We've been monitoring and documenting your artificial intelligence manipulation attempts for months. She showed Adrian footage of Viktor's psychological programming systems being used to influence artists worldwide. But instead of allowing the manipulation to succeed, creative communities had been warned about the techniques and taught to recognize and resist psychological programming. Your father's network has been feeding extremist content to artists who are working with psychologists to understand how manipulation techniques function. Instead of being radicalized, they're creating art that exposes and ridicules psychological control methods. The counter-manipulation was elegant and devastating. Viktor's attempt to discredit creative freedom by associating it with extremism had instead created a global artistic movement focused on understanding and resisting systematic psychological control. The evidence we needed to expose your father's operations isn't on the USB drive you brought. It's in the surveillance recordings of this conversation, where you've just demonstrated every technique described in our intelligence reports. Adrian looked around the cafe, finally recognizing that he was in a carefully prepared trap rather than controlling a carefully prepared manipulation. What Adrian didn't know was that our conversation had been live-streamed not just to Viktor's network, but to underground creative communities worldwide. Millions of artists had watched in real time as systematic psychological manipulation techniques were demonstrated and explained. "This cafe has been equipped with broadcast technology for 3 weeks, Marie explained. "Every word of your confession, every manipulation technique you've demonstrated, every detail about your father's psychological programming network, it's all been seen by everyone in the global creative independence movement." The educational value was immense. Artists worldwide had witnessed exactly how psychological manipulation worked, how it was implemented, and how it could be recognized and resisted. Instead of being victims of programming, they had become experts in understanding and countering it. Viktor's artificial intelligence systems depend on targets not knowing they're being manipulated. Once people understand the techniques, the programming becomes ineffective. Adrian's phone was buzzing constantly with what appeared to be emergency communications. Viktor's network was discovering that their most sophisticated psychological operations had just been exposed and neutralized in real time. The underground revolution you tried to destroy through psychological manipulation just became immune to psychological manipulation forever. With the professional crisis resolved, I faced the personal question of what Adrian's systematic manipulation meant for my own psychological development and future relationships. "I need to know something," I said to Adrian, who was preparing to leave the cafe under what appeared to be protective custody from Catherine's security team. "Were any of your emotions genuine, or was everything calculated manipulation?" His answer was quiet, defeated, and possibly truthful. "I don't know anymore. After years of professional psychological manipulation, I can't distinguish between authentic feelings and programmed responses in myself any more than you can distinguish them in yourself. The honesty was devastating and somehow liberating. Both of us had been damaged by the systematic manipulation that had defined our relationship. But that damage was something we could recover from once we understood how it had been inflicted. "The feelings you had for Thomas were real," Marie said as we watched Adrian being escorted away by Catherine's security team. "Even if Thomas was a construct designed to manipulate you, your emotions were genuine responses to positive treatment and authentic connection. How do I trust future relationships when I know how easily emotions can be manufactured?" The same way everyone trusts relationships, carefully, gradually, and with the understanding that all human emotions are influenced by circumstances and experiences. The global exposure of Viktor's psychological manipulation network had unexpected creative consequences. Artists worldwide began creating work specifically designed to help people recognize and resist systematic psychological programming. Musicians composed songs that trained listeners to identify manipulation techniques. Writers created stories that taught readers about psychological warfare. Visual artists designed works that revealed how perception could be artificially influenced. The underground revolution had evolved beyond creative freedom into creative education. Instead of just making art independently, artists were creating work that helped people think independently. Viktor tried to weaponize creativity against creativity, I realized. Instead, he accidentally trained creative people to become experts in recognizing and countering weaponized creativity. The irony was perfect. Systematic psychological manipulation had created its own antidote by inspiring artistic work that made manipulation impossible. As evening fell over Paris, I received one final message that suggested our victory over Viktor's psychological manipulation network had been only the first phase of a larger confrontation. The message was from Viktor himself. "Impressive work exposing psychological manipulation techniques to global creative communities. You've successfully immunized millions of artists against standard programming methods. Unfortunately, psychological manipulation was our least sophisticated approach to controlling creative independence. What comes next doesn't depend on manipulating individual minds. It depends on controlling the physical and economic infrastructure that creative work requires to reach audiences." Psychological control was manipulation. What happens now is simply power. You've won the battle for human imagination. Time to see whether imagination can survive without the material resources imagination needs to become reality. The real test begins tomorrow. Someone who admires your creativity but owns the systems creativity depends on. I looked out at Paris, where millions of artists worldwide were creating work that challenged every form of systematic control they could imagine. Beautiful, independent, free, and completely dependent on technological infrastructure, economic systems, and distribution networks controlled by the same people who had just lost the battle for psychological control. We had freed human imagination from manipulation. But imagination still needed tools, platforms, and resources to become reality. And someone else controlled all of those. Next episode preview. We won the war for creative freedom, but freedom means nothing without the power to act on it. Viktor's next move isn't psychological manipulation, it's economic strangulation. When you control the tools creativity needs, you don't need to control creative minds. Artists can imagine anything they want, but they can only create what the infrastructure allows. The final battle isn't about ideas. It's about who owns the means of creative production. And we're about to discover that victory was just the beginning of the real fight.